coming today. On behalf of Dr. Earl's family, I just want to thank you for being a part of his life. And of course, he was a part of the life of, I assume, everyone who is in this place. Made such a huge impact on every one of us. We will carry through the rest of our lives the memories that were created with Dr. Earl and the influence that he was able to shed on each one of us throughout our lives and throughout his life. It's just been tremendous. And so I'm glad that I believe the Lord laid it on your heart to be here. For some of you, there were probably other things tugging at your time and your attentions, but this took priority. And on behalf of his children, I just want to thank every one of you for being here. This is appropriate for us to take a few moments out. And from the start, as Bob and I were talking, Rhonda, we were talking, they wanted to make it very clear that this is not a recognition of death, but a celebration of life. And we are going to celebrate not only the accomplishments that God made through Dr. Earl, but also the blessing that he was just in our relationships with him. So may we be inspired today, and may we be drawn closer to the God that Dr. Earl served, and may we be challenged to move forward from this event, from this experience, more committed to live a life that honors God and that follows in the path that Dr. Earl trod himself. I invite you to just bow your heads with me as we get started. Lord in heaven, indeed you are a wonderful, mighty, and gracious God. Each one of us might see you in different ways, but we are together here to celebrate what you can do in a life. And how you can bless people through the work of one person. And so as we remember Dr. Earl, we just pray that your Spirit will rest on each one of our hearts and inspire us, encourage us, comfort us, and challenge us to live a life that honors you. And we thank you for this time and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hold them in high esteem because of their diligent work. Keep peaceful relationships among you all. I urge you to sound warnings for those who tend toward disorderly conduct. Do not neglect the weak ones among you. There are mentally handicapped ones who need special attention, patient kindness. Avoid the present tendency to retaliate against wrongdoers. Rather, follow the habit of doing good to your fellow members as well as to those outside of your church family. Cultivate happiness always. Be always in an attitude of prayer. Be thankful under all circumstances, for this is God's will for you who are in Christ.
Then in vision I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had vanished, and there was no great oceans. Next I, John, saw the holy city coming down to earth from heaven, all prepared as a bride for her wedding. Then the announcement from heaven came in thunderous tones. Look, God's temple is now with humanity. They will be his people from now on, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Furthermore, God will wipe away the tears from every eye, and there will be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. Those things are forever in the past.
Good afternoon. First of all, who am I? I'm those beautiful girls' dad. My name's Robert Vaca, and I am married to Tina Lau Vaca. And Grandpa Bolton was her grandpa, so I've been given the wonderful privilege to stand here before you to kind of paint this life sketch of such an incredible person. And I'm very, very honored to be here to do that. So yeah, I want to pay homage to the life of this incredible man, husband, father, grandfather, physician, musician, veteran, and friend, Robert Earl Bolton, known simply to most as Earl. Was I too far? Oh,
You're looking at the pictures and laughing at them.
oh, okay. That's fine. It's okay. All right, but often before an incredible life could even begin, other things have to go just perfectly first. For example, once upon a time, there was this young couple, fresh out of college. Fred and Maud Bolton were their names. They were newlyweds who made the brave and honorable decision to work in the mission fields of Sierra Leone, Africa. They made it there and got to work, but only a few months into their term, poor Fred fell ill and he needed to rush back to the States. So that spring of 1912, they made their way back to England to board a ship to sail to New York. They had the exciting opportunity to sail back on a huge state-of-the-art ship, but the waiting period to board it was very long, and due to Fred's illness, he had no time to spare. Luckily, they were able to catch a ride on a smaller ship leaving sooner. Sometime after getting back to the U.S., they heard some news that I imagine must have given them chills. That big state-of-the-art ship that they could have been on was lost at sea along with over 1,500 of its passengers. Many of you have already heard this story, and for those of you who hadn't, well, yes. As you're probably thinking, the ship they didn't take was the Titanic. I know, right? Chills. Goosies. And so Earl's incredible life wouldn't even have happened if it weren't for Fred and Maud making a simple little decision that saved their lives and allowed for the lives of their 4 legendary sons, the second of which being Robert Earl Bolton. Now let's fast forward a couple of years. Earl was born in McGee, Saskatchewan, Canada. He was Canadian? He was always so nice. I knew it. October 3, 1914, where his parents settled in a homestead. The firstborn son, Glenn, wasn't just Earl's big brother, but also his best buddy. They were inseparable and did everything together, including starting school at their mother's feet when Earl was only 4. And even though he was 18 months younger, Earl always stayed in the same grade with Glenn growing up. Their mother read them stories from their favorite author, Ernest Thompson Seton, and over the years they both collected Seton's books in memory of their enjoyable story time. Aside from their schooling taking place at home, church took place there as well. Family and friends took turns hosting services in their homes, as was tradition. Earl loved to tell about an embarrassing Sabbath school moment that happened when he was 4. The teacher asked if any of them knew one of the 10 Commandments. Well, Earl looked up and saw his uncle out in the hallway smoking. He quickly raised his hand and confidently exclaimed, "Thou shalt not smoke."
Amen.
Amen, right? That's right. On September 23, 1916, the 3rd son, Ralph, was born. The older boys were so close that Ralph thought they had one name together, Glenn and Earl. In fact, the adults would just refer to the 3 boys as the boys and Ralph. The 4th and final brother, Floyd, was born in the fall of 1920. Earl never forgot Floyd's birthday because he would repeat a well-known phrase from an Old English poem. "Remember, remember the 5th of November." So, yes. So now the set of legendary Bolton boys was complete. Glenn the cougar, Earl the crocodile, Ralph the walrus, and Floyd the monkey. They gave themselves these nicknames. Life was not easy on the Bolton homestead. The family lived in a mere shack, and the winters were fierce. The snow would pile up to the keyhole on the door, and at night the house would be so cold that the tea kettle, which had been boiling on the stove, the night before at bedtime was filled with ice in the morning. One day, a bull from a neighboring homestead jumped the fence heading for the Bolton's farm. Their dog, who was appropriately named Dog, managed to bark the bull back to where he belonged. They warned the neighbors about their loose bull, but a couple days later, that same bull jumped over the fence again and came charging through the property. This time, not even Dog could scare him back. Fred quickly had the boys hide in the hayloft in the barn. The boys could see through the cracks what was happening outside. Their dad tried to scare the bull off, but he was not backing down. So Fred picked up a rock to throw at it, hopefully chase it away. Now, Fred was no baseball or football player by any means, but amazingly his throw was so perfect and true, the rock hit the bull right square between the eyes, causing him to collapse. Horrified, Fred checked the bull, hoping it was only stunned, but alas, the beast was dead. That's a good throw. Reluctantly, he had to report the incident to the neighbor, who accepted the news with understanding. It's life on the homestead, I guess. But that was, life on the Canadian frontier. So when Earl was about 7, the family left the homestead and boarded a train to travel to Spokane, Washington. Crossing the Rockies, the boys were absolutely enthralled with the majesty of the mountainous terrain. They fell in love with the vast and great outdoors. It was a love that stayed with Earl and his brothers their whole lives. This led to Glenn and Earl going on countless hiking trips, traversing the highest mountain peaks they could find. I wonder how all that exercise worked out for him. Seemed to do pretty well, huh? But exercise wasn't the only healthy choice Earl made. One day, Glenn and Earl announced to the family that they wanted to be vegetarians. Now, vegetarianism wasn't a trendy way to live at the time and would have been an odd choice for just about anyone, but it was even more strange considering these two brothers were only 10 and 8 years old. And it was probably very difficult for Ma to figure out what to feed them, but she loved them, she supported them, and supported their decision. And they never wavered from their healthy lifestyle the rest of their lives. After some time, the family moved to Pomeroy, a small town in eastern Washington where Fred and Maud were teachers. Maud's sister, Verda Hood, lived close by, and the Bolton brothers soon adopted another boy into their pack, their cousin Gordon. With 5 boys growing up together, there was never a dull moment. I might even say that they were mischievous. But I would be wrong because that's not even a real word. It's for you, Early. But if I were to say the boys were mischievous, now it would be spot on. One time when a neighbor family left for vacation, the boys came up with a great idea to go into their house and carry all the furniture outside and set it up, arrange it out on the lawn exactly as it was inside the house. Well, when the neighbors returned, suffice it to say, they were less than amused with this little prank. Another time on Halloween, they picked up an outhouse and moved it a few feet away. Now, I know that doesn't sound like an awful prank, but at least it wouldn't have been if there wasn't a person inside using it at the time. Yes, they could be mischievous. When Glenn and Earl approached their junior year in high school, they were sent to Yakima Valley Academy in Granger, Washington. I like saying Yakima. A Seventh-day Adventist boarding school. Cousin Gordon also attended. Little Earl was only 13, entering his junior year at the academy, and missing his mom terribly, he cried a lot. He wrote to his parents, pleading to go home. He didn't fit in emotionally or physically with the other kids in his class. The first day he walked through campus, he heard a girl behind him say, "Hi, Babyface," name of a popular song at the time. That nickname caught on, and soon the whole school called him Babyface. While on Christmas break, he again pleaded and let his parents know his plight at school. But when it was time to return to school, his father simply told him, "Keep a stiff upper lip, Earl." And so little Babyface headed back to school to push on. Incidentally, that nickname followed him on to college. How wonderful is that? And his old classmates still called him Babyface, even when he was in his 80s. Back at Academy, Glenn and Earl faced a little problem in the dorm. You see, the dean of the dorm would barge into dorm rooms, probably expecting to catch kids misbehaving. Glenn and Earl didn't care one bit for that sort of intrusion. Even if they locked the door, the dean used his master key and walked right in unannounced. Now, growing up, they learned a thing or two about electricity. Remember when I said they could be mischievous? Well, they ripped some wire from the window screen, connected one end of the wires to the light switch, and the other to the wonderfully conductive metal doorknob. Yes, the dean was in for quite literally a shocking surprise. Sure enough, a while later, there was a noise, a grunt outside. No, he didn't die. It's okay, not like the bull. But he did get shocked, and so then they heard a loud knock on the door. It was the dean. They calmly let him in and had to explain themselves. Though the dean was not happy, the boys were spared punishment for their scheme. I really need to know how they got around punishment. If anyone knows more details, let me know. As for classes at the academy, Earl excelled, and he took typing lessons and piano lessons on the wise advice of his mother. He was always grateful for following through. Soon enough, the end of high school was approaching. Earl had grown a little since he started academy and needed new clothes, especially for graduation at the young age of 15. One teacher understood his situation, took him to Yakima, found a suit and purchased it for Earl. Babyface would soon be ready to face college. At Walla Walla College, now Walla Walla University, Earl's natural talent for music grew immensely. And while he majored in math and physics with a minor in French, one could argue that he should have minored in music. He took music major classes, such as music theory. This helped him play by ear to transpose to a different key on the piano. At the beginning of his college career, he checked out the music department, saw a xylophone, and started playing it for fun. The band director came out and asked him to play percussions in band. He never even took lessons for percussions. He just taught himself and said it was easy. That was Earl. He joined the college pep band in which he played the trumpet or cornet. At the same time, he boomed the drum with his feet. He also played the piano for boys' worship, Sabbath schools, and college chapels. Then, the Depression hit. Fred and Maud lost their teaching jobs, and the boys had to leave college. They found odd jobs to help support the family as best as they could. When Fred himself was a teenager, he learned how to make brooms. Now, with desperation to earn some money, he acquired 2 broom-making machines. I didn't even know that was a thing, a broom-making machine. He trained the boys how to make brooms perfectly during their year off from college. The following year, Glenn and Earl found a shed across the street from college. They kept one of the machines there so they could spend time making brooms to sell in order to pay for their tuition. There wasn't any room for beds, so they just suspended their beds with wire above the machine. By this time, Glenn, Earl, Ralph, and Cousin Gordon were all in college together. The 4 of them loved playing music together and singing. Well, when Ralph decided to quit college one year, their quartet was short a guitarist. They knew a senior named Kenneth Groves who played guitar and who also wanted to move out of his parents' home and be on his own. So they invited him to join them in their shack, and they formed a group. They called themselves the Cascadians, and they performed whenever possible at talent shows and programs. As you can imagine, 4 college boys playing music from a shack full of broom bits was bound to draw some attention. There were some curious little neighbor boys, about 8 to 12 years old, who wanted, they needed to find out, to know what was going on in that odd broom-making shack. They were warned with the promise of punishment not to touch anything. But one curious imp couldn't help himself, and he wantonly messed with their stuff. Such a brazen act could not be ignored, so Earl took action. He picked up the lad by his feet and dipped him headfirst for a couple seconds into a barrel of green-dyed water. It was what they used to dye the straw of the brooms. Those little rascals never caused any more trouble for Earl and the boys again. Justice was served. Cold and fast. Yeah, you probably couldn't get away with that nowadays, though. Gordon was the first of the boys to get married in 1934. Earl played the piano for his wedding. Then, right after graduating from Walla Walla, Glenn married Enid Rasmussen the summer of 1935. Then he and his new wife made the long drive down to Loma Linda, California for medical school, and he graduated in 1940. That was Glenn. Now, before I go on, I'm going to clear some things up here. I got to mention that at some point during the Depression, Glenn was able to return to college before Earl, and so they did not graduate college together. And therefore they didn't go through medical school in the same class. So now, for the first time, Earl was in school apart from Glenn. How would he survive alone without his big brother there by his side? What magic potion could cure his loneliness? I wonder. During the winter of 1935, Earl became acquainted with the Gherkins, who lived down the street from the college. Mr. and Mrs. Gherkin welcomed college students into their home to come eat, play games, and make music on Saturday nights. They were wonderful people, and they had a piano, and they had kids, and 2 of them happened to be daughters. That cures a lot. Now their oldest daughter, Marjorie, caught Earl's eye. She had a lovely voice and sang in the academy choir, and as things usually go, they fell in love. Earl hoped to teach math in the Adventist school system, but there were no jobs for him. He decided he would get his science prerequisites for medical school, and if he were accepted into the College of Medical Evangelists in Loma Linda, California, now simply known as Loma Linda University, he would propose to Marjorie Gherkin. Plans went well. Earl and Marjorie were married September 13, 1936. Part of that first year of marriage, they moved into the broom-making shack with Floyd. They got married and moved into a broom-making shack with his little brother. That's love. Tell me it's not. It is love. That's love. In 1937, Earl and Marjorie moved down to Loma Linda. That first year, they worked to save enough money for Earl to start medical school the following year. Well, as luck would have it, Marjorie got pregnant. And those days, medical school ran 6 months of the year, and the other 6 months were off so students could work. Earl spent the 6 months off in Washington working on Marjorie's dad's farm. School was scheduled to start precisely at 7 a.m. on September 5. And again, luck had its way with them. Marjorie went into labor and was sent to the hospital to deliver. So on the first day of medical school classes, their baby was born at 6:25 a.m. on September 5, 1938. They named her Elsie Mae. Earl had enough time to greet his newborn, kiss his wife, and rush off to class by 7 a.m. That's dedication. Now, in honor of Grandpa Earl, that's what I call him, let's do a little math. Add medical school, 1 wife, 1 newborn, subtract a car, you know what, for that matter, subtract a bunch of money. And what does that equal? A pretty challenging situation. That's what it equals. Okay, so it wasn't the frozen plains of Canada, nor was it living in your work shack with 3 other dudes, but it was still very tough. But Fred and Maude didn't raise any wimps, and Earl was no exception, as this next story demonstrates. Back in those days, part of medical school training was in Los Angeles. A classmate let Earl use his car while he left town a few days. Apparently, there weren't stop signs at every intersection like we have now. And one day, a cop actually stopped Earl for not stopping at an intersection with no stop sign. So Earl explained there was no reason to stop since there wasn't any cross traffic. He was given a ticket of $5 whole, which was a lot of money for Earl. Earl ignored the ticket. He ignored the ticket until he received a notice to appear at the traffic court. He showed up on time and the judge asked him how he pleaded. Earl said, "Not guilty." Then he was told to pay $10, but Earl said he didn't have that much money. The judge gave him an option. Pay the $10 or spend the night in jail. Earl chose a night in jail. Jail! I don't know if you got that. The next morning, he was released, hopped on a streetcar, and was back in time for morning class. Did I mention jail? Did you guys hear that part? Earl said his mother was horrified when she heard that story. Girls, just pay the fine. Just ask me. While Earl was interning in Portland, Oregon in January 1943, a second daughter was born, Ruth Earline. That spring, Earl graduated from medical school and soon after got the notice to take the train to Pennsylvania for Army training. He was given a captain's uniform to wear. When he arrived at the train station, Army soldiers started saluting him. Dr. Earl didn't even know how to salute yet. After some time, he was sent to Miami. Marjorie, with her 2 little girls, asked her 17-year-old brother, Dwayne, also known as Girk, that's a fun nickname, to help her drive all the way from Washington State to Miami, day and night, going no faster than 45 miles per hour. They used gasoline vouchers that were allotted during wartime. One tire shredded halfway across the country, so they just bumped along the rest of the way. In Georgia, they ran out of gas vouchers. Not sure what to do next, they stopped at a service station. Girk remembered that he had farm vouchers for trucks in his pocket. So he wandered around looking for a parked truck. He wrote the license plate number on the vouchers, went back into the station, traded them in for the much-needed gas. Yeah, I know. Don't worry, they're over it. They're over that gas. They had enough to arrive in Miami. From there, Girk boarded the train back to Walla Walla. Marjorie and the girls lived with Earl for a few months when he got the notice that he would be shipped to Italy. Dr. Earl was stationed with Army Air Corps 15th Air Force in Foggia, Italy, until 1945. He was delighted to board a plane from Naples to Foggia, his very first airplane flight. While he was stationed there, he and another officer would perform with their accordions for the enlisted soldiers every evening near the mess hall. He was delighted to have opportunities for sightseeing trips to Rome, Venice, the French Riviera, and Switzerland. Wow, war was tough on him. When war ended in 1945, he spent time in Naples, waiting for their ship to sail home. During that time, he attended concerts and took a sightseeing trip to Mount Vesuvius, where he hiked to the top and toured the ruins of Pompeii. The wait was long, but finally he boarded the ship for New York. From New York, he rode the train for the Northwest. How happy he was to see his family again. Now, let's briefly review here the boys' medical school journeys a little bit. Dr. Glenn graduated in 1940, and Dr. Earl graduated in 1943. Dr. Floyd finished medical school just a year after Earl in 1944. And remember when Ralph left college and the boys needed a new member for their musical group? Yeah, well, Ralph went a roundabout way. He joined the Marines. And now this next story really has nothing to do with Earl, but it's super cool. Anyway, so Ralph was stationed in Hawaii on the fateful day of December 7, 1941. You guys remember hearing something about that? He was supposed to be on the doomed USS Arizona, but he lacked his full uniform. So he was punished and sent to the USS Honolulu across the harbor. That Sunday morning, as the Japanese planes flew overhead, he was on KP duty. They came so close, he could see their goggles. His life was spared, and so was the ship. He relived that fateful day over and over in his mind and spoke often how very lucky he was to be alive. So now, with his parents' near fatal decision and with his miracle of survival, he thought there must be a purpose for his life. So after the war, Ralph went back to school to finish his degree at Walla Walla, and then took his family to Loma Linda University, where he received his MD degree in 1952. Wow, what an overachieving family. You hear that, girls? All right, Earl was back from his service to our country, the rough service in Venice and all those places. Service to our country, and he was delighted to hear from Glenn to come to Wenatchee, right here. and run the Bolton Clinic together. So in 1946, he was reunited with his big brother right here in Wenatchee. A house was built for Earl and his family next to Elmer and Lila Brody, resulting in a dear friendship with the Brody and Knutson clan. Is that how you say it, Knutson? In December 1946, Marjorie gave birth to their only son, Robert Frederick, Bobby. And just over 3 years later, in January 1950, their fourth baby doll was born, Alice Joy. Now, as you know, Wenatchee is, I don't need to tell you guys, Wenatchee is beautiful. With the setting next to the Columbia River, close by is Lake Chelan, thank you, for camping, picnics, boating, and water skiing. But what Earl especially loved was the location of Wenatchee, which is nestled on the edge of the Cascade Range, where he enjoyed camping and backpacking treks. For over 40 years, he hiked hundreds of miles of trails. He also climbed the 5 big volcanoes in Washington State. He also climbed Mount Hood in Oregon, Mount Whitney in California, and Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea on the big island of Hawaii. Sorry, Ray, I chopped that up for you. He was delighted when he covered the 507 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail from the border of Canada to the Columbia River across the state of Oregon. The mountain wilderness was his joy and happiness, his place of peace, his thrill of magnificent beauty, the fun of including so many church members who went along made hiking trips unforgettable. Those of you who hiked with Dr. Earl were like family to him. He remembered who went on those hiking trips, on which particular trails all those years. Now, in April of 1952, the boys were hit with some very sad news. Their loving mother, Maud, passed away from a heart attack in Kennewick, Washington. Little was known then about preventing cardiac arrest, but what Glenn and Earl knew was diet and exercise was important to sustain life more fully. So, they decided they needed to lose 30 pounds. They had a race as they watched their weight go down little by little, learning what foods to eat in order to stay healthy and lose weight, too. Each day they compared their weight. Even after they reached their goal, they compared weights daily. Up a pound, down a pound. Oh, up 2 pounds. And so it went each day. Glenn and Earl had more stamina now for the trails and more strength for carrying their backpacks. They believed in drinking lots of water. It was the early 1960s when Earl changed his diet to basically vegan. It wasn't even a word back then, vegan. But he followed that diet as much as possible the rest of his life. Soon after Maud died, her sister Verna lost her husband. So Fred married his sister-in-law, Verna, in 1953. This meant that Cousin Gordon was now officially one of the brothers. Yes, the 4 boys welcomed him as their new stepbrother. And Fred and Verna were married nearly 15 years when Fred passed away in November of 1967. When Glenn and Earl were practicing at the Bolton Clinic, Dr. Ralph moved from Ephrata, Washington, to practice in Ukiah, California. Dr. Floyd set up his practice in Exeter, California. Dr. Floyd's office loved calling the Bolton Clinic. It would go something like this. Dr. Bolton's office. Oh, let me do the phone so you know who's who. Dr. Bolton's office. This is Dr. Bolton's office calling. Dr. Bolton would like to speak to Dr. Bolton. Which Dr. Bolton would Dr. Bolton want to speak to? It doesn't matter which Dr. Bolton speaks to. Okay, I'll get Dr. Bolton on the phone to speak to Dr. Bolton. And scene. Thank you. In 1962, Dr. Glenn moved from Wenatchee to pursue his desire to specialize in surgery. Dr. Earl continued his practice at the Bolton Clinic until he sold the practice to Dr. Hal Hardin in 1984, whom I met yesterday. Lovely man. Despite the many obstacles, Earl lived a full life of happiness, but as you can imagine, he wasn't exempt from experiencing sad events. None of us are. Gordon was was first of the 5 brothers to pass away in 1976. Around late 1984, Earl and Marjorie's firstborn, Elsie Mae, was suffering from a brain tumor. Earl and Marjorie spent several weeks by her side in her home in New Hampshire until she passed tragically in April 1985. She was just 46 years old. In 2002, the youngest brother, Dr. Floyd, and his wife Colleen took a trip to the Northwest from California. They stopped at Dr. Earl's home, of course, overnight. Floyd's request was to have Earl play the piano all evening long. When Earl finished, it thrilled him to hear his brother say, "Earl, that was the best concert I have ever heard." Upon arriving home from that trip, Floyd sat down and breathed his last breath. And just 2 years later, in December of 2004, Earl's dear brother, Ralph, passed away. Now, Earl had many exciting trips in his life. In 1987, a trip of a lifetime became a reality when Earl and Marjorie, along with Marjorie's sister Darlene and her husband Clayton Prussia, were invited on a 5-week tour of China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, guided by their missionary friends who spoke the language fluently. Another memorable trip was when all 4 brothers and their wives caravaned across Canada back to McGee, where they lived as little boys out there on the Canadian frontier. Earl and Marjorie always dreamed of driving to Alaska, so in 1995 they packed their motorhome and started up in British Columbia, where they sadly met a moose at high speed. Yeah, the moose ended up near their laps with glass everywhere. At Fort St. John, they had to wait 5 days for parts before they could continue on their way to see Alice Joy and her husband Dick Brown in Anchorage. Earl, for those of you we all know, if you knew him, he was a very spiritual man. He loved God and God's Word. For over 30 years, during his devotions, his many devotions and studies, he wrote by hand Bible texts in his own words. He used his references many times as he reviewed some areas of his studies. He completed the whole Bible. By 2016, with the encouragement of Glenn Aufderhall. All right, there it is. The New Testament was published, entitled A Physician's Paraphrase. And I don't think we said it, but my daughters, they read from his paraphrase today. When Dr. Earl reached 80 years old, he was encouraged to write his memoirs on a computer. Now it's over 300 pages of delightful reading. I'm going to start reading it right now. Figure 10 pages is good enough, 1 page for every decade of his life, and a little more. Your program shows you, though, about his memoirs, where you can go online and download them. Also through the years, he would memorize long passages of chapters of the Bible, books, and poetry. And one of his favorite poems, and mine, not that I know a lot of poems, but I really like this one that he would repeat, was the Cremation of Sam Mcgee. Wherever his family and friends gathered, he was asked to recite the poem. But what was interesting was having Dr. Earl explain that he met Sam Mcgee's son. You may also check YouTube and hear his story of meeting Sam Mcgee's son and hear how he recited the poem. But yeah, if you've ever heard him recite that poem, it's wonderful. I mean, he was brilliant. That way he could just sit there and do this whole poem. It was long too. It was a long poem. It wasn't just something short. Just his eyes, the way that they sparkled as he told the story. It was wonderful. Okay, let's see. I lost my place. Okay. He also liked to do crossword puzzles daily in ink. You try that. You try that. Come on, I dare you. He did his crossword puzzles in ink, and later he picked up Sudoku. He believed in education and keeping his mind active. He loved sitting at his Steinway grand piano playing his favorite songs. His love for classical music was instilled in his children. At community concerts in town and the beautiful Liberty Theater, Glenn and Earl were probably the only parents who brought their children along. They learned concert behavior, no talking during performances, no applauding between movements, and be properly dressed up for such a fine occasion. Yeah, we need more of that. Amen. Yes. Marjorie struggled with rheumatoid arthritis during her later years, starting in 2003. Earl faithfully took care of her at home. Sadly, during that time, his dear oldest brother, Dr. Glenn, died in 2007, leaving Earl as the last man standing. 2 years later, after 72 years of marriage, Marjorie was laid to rest at age 91 in April 2009. And a little sad side note here to add is that April was a very tough month for Earl, because it had April included the passing of his mother, his daughter, and his wife. All of them pass in April. We are now giving him his final tribute in the same month. Dr. Earl and his brothers always loved a spirited game of croquet. When they got together with the younger generation of the family, they competed, calling themselves patriarchs and prophets. Yeah, was that so they could play on Sabbath? It's a Sabbath game, patriarchs and prophets. He had a delightful time playing croquet during his 100th birthday. And I tell you, at 100 years old, he just kicked my tush all around the grass there. So he had a great time, and there's a house full of people joining in on the fun. But the best was the day of Marjorie's memorial service. He had the younger generation join him with the game. Luckily, they all made it in time for Marjorie's service. Dr. Earl entered the service and sat next to his grandson, Dustin. Dustin thought it was an appropriate time to put his arm around his papa for comfort. They sat together quietly for a little while, and then Dr. Earl, Grandpa Earl, leaned over and said, "You know something?" Dustin said, "What?" Grandpa Earl said, "That was the best game of croquet I've played in a long time." And Dustin struggled to keep from laughing throughout the service as his grandfather continued to talk about the game play by play. By the way, another side note, yesterday we played the very first Robert Earl Bolton Memorial Croquet game. And there's really no need to know who won. That's not important. That's neither here nor there. Just that it happened, and it was a great time. Ray and I won. As a bachelor, Dr. Earl had ambitious plans. He wanted to remodel his home. So in 2010, at the age of 95, he went to work. He emptied all the kitchen cabinets and set it all in the garage. He chose the appliances and designed how he wanted the kitchen. He ripped out the carpets from all the bedrooms. He painted the walls and the colors that he wanted. He chose some furniture he wanted, curtains, what items he wanted to get rid of by, setting them out in the street for people to take. Thanks to dear friends advising to let him plan his bachelor pad the way he wanted, he was happy in his new design for 6 years. Because his children lived quite a distance away, the Wenatchee family friends, Knutson and Brody clan, they looked after him. They included him for Friday night family suppers, which he looked forward to every week. One exciting event Dr. Earl enjoyed at the age of 98 was the honor flight to Washington, D.C. for World War II veterans. It was a free arrangement with tours and a banquet. He was accompanied by his grandson, Ryan. And what impressed him the most were the handwritten cards from children given to him in return from his flight, thanking him for his service. At the age of 102, he figured he drove more years than anyone in the world, for he started at the age of 13 when driver's licenses weren't even required. During his later years, not only did he drive around town, he drove to Walla Walla several times to visit one of his cousins. He even drove to Vancouver to visit Bob. But at that age of 102, he had to give up his keys and move away from beloved Wenatchee. He lived with Bob and Rhonda in Vancouver, Washington, for the last few years of his life. Dr. Earl loved to be around people and make them laugh. He loved collecting funny stories to share. His sense of humor spread everywhere. Everywhere he went, which caught the attention of people all around him. And even in Walla Walla, they had asked Earl to MC a big program of the year, the Amateur Hour, at the old Columbia Auditorium in the fall of 1964. That was him. He was a joy to be around. The laughter he caused was delightful. But a time finally came when his laughter would end. Perhaps we can all carry on in our lives and spread laughter and cheer even further. On January 13, 2022, the last of the legendary Bolton brothers was at rest. He has left a legacy of compassion, humor, spirituality, appreciation of nature. So here we are celebrating his life. He had a military graveside service yesterday, setting some of his ashes there. Earl was preceded in death by his wife Marjorie, his daughter Elsie Mae Quitmeyer, his great-granddaughter China Lau, and his son-in-law Dick Brown. His three brothers, Dr. Glenn, Dr. Ralph, Dr. Floyd, and his stepbrother Gordon Hood. He is survived by his two daughters, Erlene Lau and Alice Brown, son Bob, his children-in-law, Ray Lau, Rhonda Huffaker Bolton, his grandchildren, Donna Quitmeyer, Pam Quitmeyer, Kelsey Lau and his wife Heidi, Tina Lau Vaca and her husband Robert, Dustin Lau and his wife Cassandra, Rochelle Bolton Camargo and her husband Marcelo, Ryan Bolton and his wife Samantha, step-grandchildren Jeff Brown and his wife Vera, Jennifer Brown, Greg Brown and his wife Diane, 16 great-grandchildren, and the wonderful people of his nieces and nephews. What a wonderful, wonderful legacy. We all knew him and loved him. There's a little quote here to read from Bell Hooks, an author and activist. Many of us learn as children that friendship should never be seen as just as important as family ties. However, friendship is the place in which a great majority of us have our first glimpse of redemptive love and caring community. Again, it is truly a privilege for me to stand here and sharing this relatively short synopsis of such an incredible man. Rest in peace, Grandpa Bolton.
I was kind of hoping Sam might come up here and narrate this. This is from Jack Knutson's movie camera in 1948, we think. Some of you old timers, and I see who you are, some of you, will remember some of these people.
Yeah, originally we could actually stop the action, but this was a movie that Dad ended up shooting, and if any of you who went to school here was over next door, you'll notice that the front of the school did not even have the front steps on it. And there's kind of a cute story that goes along with this school, was the fact that they had the women's bathroom and the boys' bathroom in the back end. And if you measured the bricks on the back side, on the girls' side, there was, I think, one more brick than there was on the boys' side. And the joke was, that's what you get when you get labor that's donated. But to me, as we started collecting a lot of Dad's old movies and trying to put them together, when Bob got a hold of me, it was pretty cool because, like some of these people, like that was a Bolliard right there, and that's Jake Thompson. And you'll see that person I don't know. You realize Bob was like 1 or 2 years old, and I might have been maybe 3 or 4. That was Blake now and Lyle and Elmer, and that lady I don't know. That is, I think, that's my grandpa. But to see these old movies brings back such great memories, because this church, like when Dr. Earl was a part of it, it was such a big family. Every Saturday night, we would go to Dr. Earl's house, or we would go to Dr. Glenn's house, or Lila and Elmer's house. They would play volleyball. But it was so much fun at that time for us, because as kids, we didn't have to worry about cell phones, games, or whatever. Your parents kicked you outside and you went out and played. Although I know with Bob, I always felt sorry for him, because I remember his mother calling him to come back and play, to practice the piano. And my mother wanted me to play, but it never worked out that well. So it was such. Now, I think that was Henrietta Thomas, wasn't it? I think she was a school teacher. That was what this whole thing was about. But I mean, these are the greatest memories, to grow up in the generation that Bob and I grew up with. I'll tell you what, it was absolutely, I mean, to me it was idyllic. And I feel sorry for the young people today that do not have that camaraderie, do not have that church around them. To me, it was so special. Because no matter what, when I come back to Wenatchee, when I moved away, no matter what age, I always looked at Wenatchee as, I'm coming home. And I hope all of you who come from out of town, like Earl, Alice, or whatever, I hope you all realize that we always love to have our old friends come back to Wenatchee. And there was nobody, I got to tell a quick one about this. One time, Dr. Earl told my mother a joke that told my dad, and I overheard it. So I was in school in about the 3rd grade, and so I told the joke, and it was the polar bear joke. If you know it, I'm not going to tell it, but anyway, the teacher was a little upset, so she called Dr. Earl. Dr. Earl then told my mother that from now on, I was not the spokesman for his jokes. And I stopped. But I always had a great relationship with Dr. Earl, because when I was young, I had to have my appendix taken out, and Dr. Earl was the one, he diagnosed it. Dr. Glenn was the one, and I think I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. And I remember one thing, before they did surgery, it made me feel so good, they prayed. And you don't know how, when you're a little kid and you're going into surgery, you think, hey, maybe you're going to die. You don't even know it. And to have that kind of comfort, to me, was really, really special. And to have Dr. Earl come to our family every Friday night, we felt so special. And I heard a lot of his jokes about the horse and the mane, and a lot of them that I couldn't tell. But anyway, he was extremely special to all of us. And God bless you for allowing us to honor somebody who was a town pillar and also in our church. I mean, he was absolutely phenomenal. He always made everyone feel special, and he always, like I said, he had such a quiet grace about him. And that to me, it was so special, but God bless them.
Next we're going to have, well, some of you were here 7.5 years ago when Dad turned 100 and we had a little party here. Might have been about the same size as this one. And Dusty, Erlene's youngest, had put together a video with some slides. You see some of those slides are on here all the time as well, but we thought we'd play this over again. It was really enjoyable, so enjoy. Sorry, I must have been miscommunicated on that one. It's the, what's it called? It's a DVD. This is the DVD one. Sorry about that. This one here we'll do later. So please play the DVD. Well, I guess we'll either not do that one or we'll do it later. The next piece we have on the program had to do with remembering and reminiscing a little bit. Since this program is getting long, I don't want to cause any problems for anybody here, but we will go ahead and do the reminiscing. This is the right thing. Now, it was mentioned already that Dad loved the mountains. And somehow or the other, I picked that up too, from him. The very first experience I had in the mountains was at age 4. And we climbed Mount Pilchuck. Some of you know where that is, over by Everett. And I will just say now, you'll see a picture later or two, that 50 years later, Dad was 86 and I was 54. We did it again. So you won't believe it. You'll see pictures of Dad as an 86-year-old on that trail. I want you to notice my oldest sister, Elsie, in the background there. Notice the face. She was the only one in the group. Well, Dad had a sort of a smile, but she was the only one in the group that was showing any happiness whatsoever. And that was her. She loved the mountains as well. And even up until very late in her life, even while she was sick, she went on a late backpack trip and had to leave early because she was too sick. So that's indicative. Yeah, it's not working. So that's me in 1953. You know where that is. I wanted to make it look as dangerous as possible, so I put my feet up. And many years later, my dear wife and I, Rhonda, we went down to Grand Canyon and found this same rock. She took a picture of me with my feet up in the air again. I couldn't find that picture though. Next. So I was hoping Cousin Nita would be here because she's in this picture. But Erlene's up on top. AJ Alice is right in front of her. I'm off to one side because I always had to do something a little different. And the other two, some of you may remember, many of you may remember Dr. Lloyd Smith and his wife Edith, and those are their two younger children, the other two. Again, my first experience in the mountains where I was looking down on clouds, 1955, I guess I was 8, and I told Dad, I said, I want to jump into the cloud, Dad. And he advised me not to. Next. This is 1957. My second backpack, well, actually my third if you count that one from that first picture. But you can see that the equipment was wonderful back in those days. There was no waist strap, no pads on the shoulders, and of course that back part is nice and straight and hard. Yeah, that was real comfortable too. But actually it was good because having carried one of these things on several backpack trips, it was so nice to have a real comfortable pack to wear that could carry a lot more weight as well without pain, or not too much. So I was kind of glad for this experience. Next. Now, this is the summit of my very first mountain that was off trail. I guess Mount Pilchuck was a trail to the summit. That's Dad, though, on the summit. I took that picture of him when I was 10 years old. The next one is me coming down from there. So the first evidence that I ever climbed a mountain is right there. Next. In 1960, a bunch of the kids from our church here, not including Sam, unfortunately, went with Dad and Mom and Edith Smith, and we did a whole week backpack trip from Meander Meadows, if you guys know where that is, the end of the little Wenatchee River Road, all the way down to Stevens Pass. And that picture is near the top of Grizzly Peak and right along the trail, and you can see why Dad loved the mountains. In fact, the big peak there is one of those 5 big volcanoes, and it's his favorite mountain, Glacier Peak. Next. All right, this one takes a little explaining. On that trip, we wanted to go swimming in Lake Janus. The water was warm, the weather was warm, so unfortunately nobody had bathing suits, but the kids had cutoffs, so we could wear our cutoffs, but Dad had nothing except his skivvies. Didn't really want to, show off his skivvies for the ladies. So he asked Edith if she had anything she could put over his skivvies. So there is a pair of, let's say, intimate female apparel over the top of his skivvies so he could go swimming. And the look on his face, by the way, was the look he always had to give when he was trying to keep from laughing. Next one.
Kids, the idea that they became families.
Oh yes, there was a family connection with things that happened like this, and I could tell you another one too. Some of you know about the Pacific Crest Trail, I assume, and south of Snoqualmie Pass, I think it is south, yeah. There's a lake called Stirrup Lake, like the stirrups on, with a horse. Well, when Dad and his mixed party showed up at Stirrup Lake one day on a hike on a backpack trip from Snoqualmie down to, I guess it was Chinook Pass. They got there and they all wanted to take, it was hot and they'd been sweating and dirty and they wanted to get cleaned up, and so the men went that way on the lake and the women went that way on the lake. So there's a couple of good memories that come out of this. One is they changed the name of the lake to Strip Lake. And one more part of that, they came up with this description of how to take a bath in a mountain lake. You see, you don't want to really stay stripped too long, so you want to be a little bit modest, so you wash down as far as possible, and then you wash up as far as possible, then you wash possible. So our family has had a little different meaning for the word possible. This is the end of that same trip there with all the kids. And, Dad, you can recognize, probably don't recognize anybody else. Next, please. My dear cousin Jack is here, and we took a day hike one time with Jack's family, Gordon Hood, and Jack. And Dad captured this picture on a slide of the two of us together. And I love this picture. Next, please. All right, in '62, 3 of the families from this church, and their kids really, went up to a little lake south of Stevens Pass and camped for a weekend, I guess it was. And this is a shot that Dad got of his plane. Alice is on the right, and I'm in the water, and that's Rick Roderick and Roger Cumbo, and then Rick's younger brother, Fritz. Next. I had to throw this one in. 1965, someone at Mount Whitney, with Dad and me on the right, and George Putmeyer on the left, my dear niece's father. Next. Now, some of you may have hiked, backpacked up into the Enchantment Lakes. Anybody? I want to see a hand. All right, good. So, I suspect you did it well, there's 2 ways to get in there. One is from the Snow Lake trailhead, and one is another higher trailhead. We came in from Snow Lakes. This is 1967. That's a picture that my dad took of my backside. And you can see, now notice the, I don't know if you can see this thing, I guess you can't, but there's a cairn right down at the bottom on the right, and then there's a ribbon up just above my pack. That was well before there was a trail up to the enchantments from the Snow Lake side. So we were kind of pioneers, but there were people that went ahead of us. Now that's one of the most popular hikes there is. Next, please. There's Dad on that same quote-unquote trail, scrambling over a step. Another one, please. And I'm going to move through these quickly to show you Dad's eye, the love of beautiful scenery that he had. This is not the beautiful scenery, well it is, but I'm in there ruining it. But anyway, just gotta step through these. He had a very, very sensitive eye for beauty. Notice the color of the water, we loved it. Okay, in 1976, there was a split in there somewhere. Dad and I went from Harts Pass to the Canadian border, back to Harts Pass, and then down to Rainy Pass on the new trail. If you're familiar with the new trail on the Pacific Crest Trail, the old trail was abandoned because they built the North Cascade Highway, and that's where it used to go. So they built a new trail up higher. Did you work on that trail, Harold? Did you? Was that your contract? Okay, but you did work on it. Right. We've had some tremendous trail builders in our church family here over the years. Anyway, that's Dad and I just starting out. Go ahead. And later on in the trip, I never was really a hippie. This is up in the Foss Lakes area, off Stevens Pass Highway. Dad and I spent 3 days or 4 days up in there in 1979. Next. 1983, Ray, you were there, and your oldest, it was, yeah, just your oldest, and his friends. We hiked from Snoqualmie Pass to Cathedral Rock and the Cleona River for about a week. And that's Dad on the trail there in 1983. Next, please. All right, so I included this one in another scenery shot. This is kind of the picture that I think characterizes my dad in terms of his beauty, the love of beauty in the mountains. That is his favorite peak, Glacier Peak. That's Image Lake in the foreground, a favorite spot for mountain lovers in Washington. And that's the picture, excuse me, I knew it was going to hit me eventually. That's on his urn. Next, please. That's Dad in 87, looking out over the Upper Lyman Lake Basin from Spider Gap, in case you wanted to know. He always wore that undershirt, t-shirt type, to stay cool. Next, please. Another scenery shot. I had no idea he had been here. This spot, excuse me. I love the mountains too, you can tell. But anyway, that's a spot that is forever indelibly impressed on me because of a great story that happened to me in 1975. I had no idea he had ever been there. My favorite mountain is Dome Peak on the far left. Next, please. One of his later, in fact, he was 75 here, and that's the age I am now. And he climbed the south peak of Ingalls Peak, not a technical climb. And so that's him up there, and the next one is in your program as well, please. Is one of my favorite pictures I've ever seen of my dad. Next, please. There's my son Ryan, and Dad and I, and that's the peak that we had climbed on that previous couple slides. Next, please. Okay, in 1993, Dad was 78, and two of my buddies and their sons, and my son, that's Ryan there with a mouthful of food, and Dad, we all climbed Mount St. Helens, of course, after the eruption. And so that's just a shot on the way up there, next peak. That's on the summit. Now, so there's 3 generations in our family, plus the other 2 fathers and sons. Now, a little story about that. So, Dad's standing in a circle on the summit, in the fog, can't see anything. But he makes quite a stir, as you might imagine, being 78 years old and standing up on this summit. So a lot of the other people that are on the summit are enjoying getting a little bit acquainted with Dad. And one guy kind of didn't see what was going on, and he finally came over to the group and kind of wedged into the circle. And when he could get a word in edgewise, he said, well, sir, I'm sorry, I didn't catch how old you are. And Dad said, well, I'm 78. The guy said, huh, I'd have sworn you weren't a day over 77. Dad loved that story and told it many times later. Next, please. And as we were coming down, as mountaineers will, we like steep snow, or at least somewhat steep snow, to glissade, that's the name of that activity. So he was glissading down the snow fingers coming down the mountain. And at one point we got fairly close to the quote-unquote trail that leads up there, that a lot of folks were on the trail. As he went by them, they were clapping like crazy, giving him the old man sliding on the snow. Next, please. This is one of our favorite spots. I took him up there only once. If anybody's been to Tuck and Robin Lakes, this is Tuck Lake. Anybody? Yep. And that's one of the buttresses of Mount Daniel behind there. Next, please. All right, in 1994, now Dad was not quite 80. 79 years old, he's over there if you can't tell. This is the highest point, the mountain in the background is the highest point in Utah, over 13,000 feet. It's a very long hike to get to it. Well, Dad didn't make the summit that day. He only hiked 22 miles round trip at age 79. Now you have to understand one thing about Dad. He had a deformed foot most of his life because of a broken foot that happened while he was 14 years old that never got reset. So there was a lot of arthritis in that, and it really caused him a lot of pain, and he did that stuff anyway. Next, please. This is 50 years later on Mount Pilchuck. We met at the trailhead and hiked it again. So next couple of slides, please. That's him on the trail with the summit up there somewhere. And the next one is us in the summit lookout. Next, please. Mom died, as was said, in 2009 in April. We had her memorial service, and right after that, I was heading for Southern Oregon to do some mountains. And I said, "Dad, you want to go with us?" He says, "You bet." And he wanted out into nature again. He hadn't been there for a long time. So I took him with me. Well, I had this little 4Runner that could, pretty much like a Jeep. And the road was a Jeep road, and bumpy and high clearance and 4-wheel drive and all that stuff. He made it clear he'd never been in an adventure quite like that before. But we got up to the high point, and I brought some poles for him so he could wander around while we went and climbed the little peak. Next one, please. Now, this is 2012. Do the math. He was 97. And I came up to visit him Memorial Day weekend. I was still working, and I said, "Dad, you want to go out? Hit a few little small summits around Wenatchee here." "Sure." So he was still walking a lot then, not jogging, however. And so I took him up. This is the north peak of Birch Mountain. And we didn't hike very far, but he did have to hike up. And in the slideshow, you can see some pictures of him going up the road. Next, please. While up there, that was the same place. One of the Chelan County deputies we encountered in a dirt bike, and he took this picture of us. Next, please. And then the next day, I believe it was, I took him on his last bushwhack, 97 years old, and just scroll through these quickly. There he is on the summit. His last summit. Now, that was his last summit as a living human being. Next slide. That's going to be his last summit as a no longer living human being. We kept some small amount of ashes, and we decided we'd put him here. Why here? Well, this is from Google Earth. Somebody had taken this picture from the summit. And anybody know the mountain on the left? It's Mount Stewart. The Enchantment Lakes Basin is overlooked by the peaks on the right. This is Dad's home turf, right? And so that's the view from where we're going to leave some of his ashes. And by the way, the name of the peak is, of course, Earl Peak. And you remember the story about his family. Just east of Earl Peak is a little mountain called Three Brothers. So Earl and Three Brothers. And by the way, 22 miles west of here is another mountain called Four Brothers. So I thought it was a fairly appropriate spot for some of Dad's ashes. Thank you very much.
Psalm 121. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow, who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in, from this time forth and even forevermore.
I just whispered to Bob, I asked him if I could announce the closing song, because I thought that might be the most comforting words I could bring to you. But he asked me to say a few words about Doctor. I have so many stories that came from our working together on this. And when he was 101, I called him one day and I said, you know, we might be able to publicize your Bible if you go with me to a week of prayer in Calgary, Alberta. He jumped at the opportunity, so I picked him up in my Jeep Grand Cherokee, and we drove to Calgary. He was the star of the evening programs because he played the piano every night. And then Wednesday night, we announced that it would be a health interview with Dr. Bolton. I'd asked him to preach, but he said no, he wouldn't do that, but he would do an interview. And one of the questions was, believe it or not, are those your real teeth? And he grinned and said, yep. On the way home, we had a little incident. He didn't want to stay another night in a motel if we didn't have to, and he had forgotten some of his medication. So we were driving late at night, terrible rainstorm. I was trying to get him home before he got too tired, but he was kind of snuggled up in the right-hand seat, had a little nest to nestle into. And I was probably overdriving the lights a little bit. And when I saw something big and black in the middle of the road, there was no time to stop. There was traffic coming a little ways away, and I had to hit it. It was already dead, fortunately, but my Jeep bounded over the top of it, shook Earl up a little bit, said, what did we hit? And as I drove on, the car seemed to work pretty good. So I kept going. Then pretty soon I kept hearing something scraping. I said, oh, whatever I hit's probably hung up under the Jeep there. So I pulled off at the first place I could find a street light. And Dr. Earl, in his typical fashion, said, hey, I'll crawl under there. I'm a lot younger than you are. I didn't let him, but I found out that it had scraped the skid plate off of my Jeep. And so I found a station and drove up on a couple of blocks and got under there and wired it up. He was great when we got him back to his home, thanked me for the trip, and I will always remember that. But I hadn't intended to tell this, but in light of everything that has happened, I must tell you that one of the favorite jokes I learned on that trip was, he was explaining that he was a scientist and they had just discovered that diarrhea is inherited. It's in your genes. I regret a couple of things. I regret that we didn't get the whole Bible published, but we didn't have the money to do that. I regret that I didn't ask him what his favorite text was. But I believe that it was one of 5, I'm not sure which one, but there are 5 texts in the New Testament where Paul says, be followers of me as I am a follower of Christ. And that, I think, is a favorite, or an appropriate motto for Dr. Bolton. He practiced what he preached. He was a friend to everybody, especially to Christ. So I count it one of the great privileges to have gotten better acquainted with him and to have those few moments together in his lifespan. and thank you for inviting me to have a little part of this. Incidentally, if any of you want to get one of these paraphrases, it's still available on Amazon.
So, you've heard other things about Dad, such as he loves music. And some of that's been passed along, as you could tell from the piano, both before the service and during. But Erlene was the real star. And she was the accompanist for all of the choral and whatnot that happened while she was at school, in academy, in high school. But her major professor at Walla Walla was a great friend of our family, Dr. Melvin West. And some of you will remember that in 2014, at his 100th birthday, we sang, I should have got a hymnal, I don't see one here. But we sang 221 exactly. Where is the hymnal? Anyway, somebody could bring that up. Dr. West made a CD with many hymn improvisations on it. Most of them are, thank you very much. Most of them are, let's say, you can't sing with him because he is such a great improviser. But the very last one on that CD is one of my favorite tracks of music. And it's hymn number 221, Rejoice the Lord is King. And we have a CD, and I think we'll have it loud enough that you won't hear yourself sing. So you don't have to worry about anybody else hearing you sing either. I would really like for you to belt it out, whatever you want to call it, and let's sing praises and rejoice in this celebration of my dad. If you would like to stand, that'd be even better.
Your Lord and King adore.
gracious Father, what a joy it has been to be acquainted with your servant, Dr. Bolton, and with your Son, Jesus Christ, because Dr. Bolton pointed us to him. And someday, very soon, we'll all rejoice in your presence. We're looking forward to that day, and we pray that you'll help each of us be as helpful, as trustworthy, as faithful, and endure as Dr. Bolton did. In Jesus' name we ask it. Amen.
All right. I want everybody to come up here and sing right here right now. Come on up.
Okay, let me explain briefly here. You saw in the program that we're going to have a sing around the table, piano, sorry. This is a Bolton family tradition, and we just thought it'd be a fun way to end this celebration. So the words, if you would like to join in, are in your program. If you don't want to join in, that's fine too. You can listen, or you can find your way out if you wish. But this is the end, otherwise, of this program. Please join us if you like to sing.
Just all of a sudden died. I was still flopping.